taxation, raising revenue and reducing inequality in South Africa. I am thrilled to witness such an enthusiastic audience and our expert panel all gathered here to just deepen our understanding in this significant topic. This session will focus on the role of personal income tax and other progressive taxation strategies in tackling our challenges of revenue generation and inequality reduction. Without further ado, help me welcome Dr. Hubert, who is a senior lecturer at the Department of Economics here at the University of South Africa. Dr. Hubert will be giving us a welcome note. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Hubert.
Thank you very much, Nomfunde. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning and very welcome to this event. My name is Fani Hubert. As she said, I'm a lecturer in the Department of Economics, and yeah, it is my privilege to welcome you all today to this event. And I'm sure that, like myself, you're also looking very much forward to a robust discussion on some very important matters regarding tax policy in South Africa. Before I start, can I kindly give me some time to acknowledge some of our dignitaries here? Firstly, Dr. Masachaba, the Acting Executive Dean of the College of Economic and Management Sciences. Doctor, I don't know if you want to give us a small wave. Thank you. Thank you, Doc. And then I don't want to make exceptions, but just a few of the members of the SA-TIE team. First is Mr. Kunal Sen, the Director of UNU Wider. Sorry, I don't know you, so welcome. Dominic Etienne, the Head of the Program and Partnership at UNU Wider. Thank you. Then Ms. Boipuso Modise, the Deputy Director General of Economic Policy at National Treasury. And Mr. Johnston Makubu, the Deputy Commissioner of SARS. And then, of course, all the delegates from the European Union and also from the UK FCDO. You are all very welcome. And then lastly, I would also like to thank and welcome our members of the panel, and they will be introduced shortly during the session by the moderator. Then, of course, last but not least, all colleagues and attendees here today, thank you for attending, and you are very welcome. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the saying goes that in life, nothing is certain except death and taxes. And as far as the first one goes, I think you will agree with me that there is a lot of conflicting advice of what an individual should do to improve his or her longevity. Now, I don't want to go on too much about this point, except to say, if they could kindly once and for all tell us if coffee and red wine is now good or bad for us. But I think this is a discussion best left to our colleagues from the medical fraternity. As far as the second one, taxes, it is evident that similar to the first one, there also exists various conflicting views on the matter. The most obvious being who should be paying and how much of it we should be paying. If I can take you to a brief overview of state finances in South Africa, there are some interesting historic trends that we can see if we look at the last 3 or so decades. Firstly, around 1990 to 1994, during the democratic transition years, we know that state finances were clearly in trouble, with revenue falling and expenditure rising as compared to a percentage of GDP. Post-1994, we saw a reversal of these trends as revenue collection started to stabilize while expenditures were reined in. This led to South Africa actually being able to run fiscal surpluses around 2007 and 2008. But unfortunately, then came the global financial crisis in 2008 and 2009. Following this, expansionary fiscal policy was rightly so employed to try and buffer some of the effects of the GFC. But this meant that expenditure shot higher during a period of economic stagnation, which hampered revenue collection. The state was unable to close this gap that opened between expenditure and revenue during what turned out to be basically the next decade. And then, of course, we all know, then COVID-19 hit, and we had another shock on an already fragile fiscal state. In hindsight, it is thus evident that the 2008-9 global financial crisis was to a large extent the catalyst which derailed to a large extent South Africa's fiscal train, and that the current choices are in actual fact as a result of years of inability to stabilize this situation. We can also look at this from a debt perspective, and it is quite striking to note that in 2008, South Africa's total national gross loan debt was around 577 billion. Earlier this year, in the February budget, we saw that this debt had ballooned to 5,207 billion, or roughly 10 times what it was in 2008. This leads to significant increases, especially on items such as the interest that South Africa needs to pay on its debt, which again crowds out various other important spending items in the budget. UNISA itself is also affected by this, as we receive a significant portion of our annual income from the fiscus. It is against this backdrop that I want to reiterate my point of how important the discussion such as today's are. Given the exceptional panel of experts we have lined up today, I do not want to delve too much into personal income taxes, except to give some observation of what seems to be a very polarized discussion in South Africa. On the one extreme, you have people advocating that the so-called rich should be taxed more, while on the other end of the spectrum, there are those that feel that they are already being overtaxed and they get very little in return for paying their taxes. This no doubt makes Treasury's job very hard in trying to find some middle ground between these views. Lastly, I would like to briefly close by noting the role of academics in the debate and how important it is for us, especially to drown out some of these noises from outside and to critically reflect on the available scientific research on the topic. And only then to provide a balanced and objective feedback as well as policy advice on the matter. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you again for the opportunity to say a few welcoming remarks, and I look very much forward to today's discussion. I thank you.
Thank you so much for that warm welcome. I believe we are all welcomed and comfortable now. Before we continue with our program, we do have ablution facilities on your far right. And right now, I would like to welcome Ms. Boipuso Modise for opening remarks.
Wonderful. It's always very interesting to walk up to a podium because, you know, the first port of call is to figure out how high or low the microphone is. Usually too high, but today we've done well. Morning, everybody. I'll be making some opening remarks this morning prior to the panel discussion. I was initially requested to welcome you, but that's happened twice already, so I will save you a third welcome. But I will say that I'm glad that you have all attended today's SA Tide Policy Dialogue, which we've hosted today in collaboration with UNISA's Department of Economics. Your partnership, UNISA, is appreciated in making today's discussion possible. I'd also like to acknowledge representatives from the National Treasury, from the South African Revenue Services, UNU-WIDA, the UK Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, and the European Union. These institutions have played invaluable roles in supporting the various aspects of the SA Tide program. And building on the collaborative efforts that have shaped SA Tide, today's gathering provides a platform to explore how personal income tax as a component of South Africa's tax system can further be optimized to support the country's broader socioeconomic objectives, including fostering sustainable growth while reducing poverty and inequality. I want to extend a special thanks to our panelists for making time to be here. Your expertise and perspectives will guide us through this conversation, and I look forward to hearing the insights that you'll bring today. As we begin this dialogue, it's worth acknowledging the broader fiscal context in which it is taking place. As we all know, South Africa has had growth outcomes that have been poor over the past several years, and this has had implications on the revenues that can be collected. At the same time, demand for public goods and services, including through the social wage, remains high. Resultantly, the fiscal strategy that was articulated in the budget this year necessarily maintains a balanced approach to fiscal consolidation, comprising of expenditure restraint, moderate revenue increases, while continuing to support the social wage and ensuring additional funding for critical services. This reflects, among others, the need for faster and more sustained growth and subsequently higher revenues. While progress is being made in this regard through the implementation of reforms in key industries that support economic activity, growth, and competitiveness, like electricity, more needs to be done. The successes of the first phase of Operation Vulindlela, which I'm sure many of us know about, will be amplified by the second phase. This should and will continue to be coupled by the provision of a clear and stable macroeconomic framework, along with the improved capacity of the state to provide critical goods and services that support economic activity. Collectively, these elements will support South Africa's growth and subsequently revenue outcomes. In this backdrop, revenue collection remains an important aspect of the fiscal strategy and its redistributive efficacy more generally. As such, understanding the impacts and consequences of policy actions in the tax system is important. We know that the tax system needs to be as efficient as is possible to facilitate economic growth by minimizing distortions and obstacles to investment, innovation, and employment. The growing body of evidence under the Public Revenue Mobilization for Inclusive Development workstream under the SA Tide program allows us useful insights into the tax system. These insights can help us as policymakers to ensure that the system operates efficiently while also being equitable. Looking more closely at our revenue system, personal income tax is a significant tax instrument, and we have a very progressive PIT schedule. Despite this, gaps in compliance, especially among high earners, can reduce its overall impact and contribution to the redistributive impact of the fiscal system. Strengthening enforcement mechanisms and increasing transparency will not only help personal income tax better serve its purpose, but also build greater public trust in the tax system and contribute to broader economic stability. Today's dialogue will undoubtedly contribute towards refining how we approach the challenges and opportunities before us. I look forward to hearing the perspectives of our panel and the people in this room and ideas as we explore the ways that PIT can continue to support South Africa's long-term developmental goals. Thank you very much.
We thank you, Ms. Modise, for the opening remarks. So we will be moving on with our program. Up next, we have Yuka Patilla, who works with Workstream 2 Lead at the SA Tide for our policy dialogue framing.
Yes, good morning, everybody, also from my behalf. Yes, I'm Jukka Pirttila. I come from University of Helsinki, and I also work as an external researcher in the UNU wider program on taxation here in South Africa. And I co-lead the work on revenue mobilization together with Professor Nadine Riedel from University of Münster, who's also here. So I have already worked quite some time on tax issues, both using data from my own country and from elsewhere. And one special strength of the South Africa setting is the very extensive thank you, administrative tax data sets which is available for researchers here in South Africa. So that's even in the world scale quite uncommon to have such rich data available for us. So these data sets enable us to really, look at the patterns and derive insights that can hopefully then directly influence the policy making in the country. So we look at how firms and individuals react to tax policies, and this then helps to craft these tax policies, taking into account the unique needs of the South African society. So accessing, utilizing these rich data sets doesn't happen in isolation. It's a result of collaboration with SARS, and which is facilitated by the National Treasury. And it's this collaboration which makes it possible. Let me now mention a couple of research studies that we have done under this work stream on revenue mobilization that hopefully speak to the theme of today's panel. So there was one paper which is available, all this is available from the TSA webpage, looking at the possible reforms to the personal income tax system here using tax benefit microsimulation modeling that we have developed together with colleagues at SARS. And with this modeling tool, one can look at different choices and how they would influence revenue, and also how equitable the tax system is. Very recently, we completed another study which examined the revenue consequences of an increase in the highest marginal tax rate in this country. That this increase took place in 2017. And we tried to understand what happened to the tax revenues afterwards. One would expect that the tax rate increase would typically lead to an increase in revenues. That would be the gut reaction of any public finance economist. But actually, in this research, which is joined with Nadine and Chris Axelson here, we came to the conclusion that the taxpayers declined their revenue so much, or their reported income so much, that the revenue actually didn't increase, it rather declined. So I believe this sort of research just underscores some of the difficult challenges that the policymakers face when trying to strike a balance between the efficiency and the equity of tax systems. There's more to come, we are busy working on understanding how the tax audits influence taxpayer behavior, and there's also a paper which evaluates how some of these recent international tax agreements, especially those on information exchange, may then help also South Africa to gather more revenue especially from the higher end of the income distribution. In addition to conducting research, we also try to focus on what is called capacity development. So we try to take on board local researchers, especially early career local researchers. And I should say that it would be completely impossible for us to carry out this research without the participation of these hardworking and talented South African researchers. We also arrange various training events and that sort of things that further then hopefully enable capacity development going forward. To conclude, producing high-quality research is one thing, but it's also equally important to then disseminate these findings. And this is the reason we are here today. So we in this essay type program, we try to organize this policy dialogue that bring together various stakeholders to debate and discuss, and then start from the research finding, and then try to ponder what they mean and how we could develop in this case, the tax and perhaps also the benefit system further. Without further ado, I just look forward to the insights of the panelists and all of you from today's discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Patella, for that insightful contribution and research on tax. And as we're about to transition now to our panel discussion, help me welcome our moderator, Dr. Mphahlele Ndlovu, who is the chair of the Department of Taxation here at the University of South Africa.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you for spending your time with us this Friday morning. All protocols are observed, and as this is a hybrid event, I also would like to welcome our guests who are joining us online. My name is Mphahlele. I'm a tax researcher from UNISA's Department of Taxation in the College of Accounting Sciences. Personal income taxes remain the largest contributor to tax revenue in South Africa, with a contribution share of 35% amounting to 602 billion. Due to its significant contribution to the state revenue, careful consideration is needed before changes can be made to the current personal income tax system. It is therefore important that we need to use evidence-based research to support any policy proposals, without which some of these policy changes may result in unintended consequences. During the 2022 tax year, 25.9 million taxpayers were registered for personal income taxes in South Africa. Of this, only 7.1 million were expected to submit tax returns, and eventually 6 million were assessed. The majority of those assessed featured in the lower tax brackets, while less than 2% featured in the top tax bracket. It is important to note, however, that the tax collected from those in the top tax bracket was the highest compared to any other tax bracket. And this is yet another reminder of the high levels of inequality in South Africa. Since the introduction of the new top tax bracket in 2017, the personal income tax rates in South Africa have fairly remained constant. However, some researchers argue that this is not a true reflection, because some tax rate increases are disguised as non-inflation adjustments to the tax brackets, such as we have seen in the 2023-2024 tax proposals. In its publications, the government of South Africa continues to reassure us that tax will be collected in a sustainable and equitable manner. This means that tax policy will focus on broadening the tax base, improving tax administration, and lowering tax rates. Nevertheless, there are ongoing public and policy discussions about further reforms to the personal income tax system, including proposals to convert tax deduction for retirement contributions to tax credits, as well as adjustments to the marginal tax rate schedule. The panelists gathered here today will help us answer the question of whether there is room for further adjustments to the marginal tax rate schedule, or perhaps there are other policy measures that can be put in place to raise additional revenue while also reducing inequality. The era of fourth industrial revolution is upon us, and smart taxation entails the ability by tax administrators to come up with different technological innovation that ease tax compliance and enforcement. The discussion this morning will touch on the strides made at SARS regarding the use of technology innovation in tax compliance and tax enforcement. With this background, the main objective of today's dialogue is to evaluate South Africa's personal income tax system, as well as explore the potential reforms to improve its effectiveness. The discussions today will analyze the recent changes to the personal income tax structure, scrutinize their impact on taxpayer behavior, revenue collection, and inequality. The discussion will also look at administrative advancement in tax enforcement. In the midst of the complex environment that South Africa finds itself in, it is important. The importance of fiscal policy in driving equitable growth and sustainable development cannot be underestimated. The personal income tax system stands out as a key instrument within the policy framework, not only for its significant contribution to state revenue, but also for its potential to address income inequality. The panelists will draw from their expertise and SA-tied research to discuss policy options that could improve the personal income tax system's redistributive impact, as well as increase revenue, stimulate economic growth, and optimize the overall tax mix. I have here with me an amazing panel replete with expertise covering the fields of taxpayer rights, tax policy making, tax enforcement, private sector, as well as economics and academia. It is now time that I introduce our panelists, and I will start at my far right. Christopher Axelson is the acting head of tax and financial sector policy at the National Treasury. His responsibilities include, among others, providing policy advice on tax proposal. Seated next to Christopher is Yanga Mbuta. Yanga is the tax ombud and brings with her over 20 years of tax experience acquired at various organizations, including SARS, the National Treasury, and the private sector. Sitting next to Yanga is Eko Egan, who is based in Johannesburg and leads the Ernst & Young Africa tax practice. He specializes in international tax planning and associated tax controversies. Next is Ingrid. Ingrid Woolard is the Dean of the Faculty of Economic and Management Sciences and Professor of Economics at Stellenbosch University. Her areas of specialization include the measurement of poverty and inequality, unemployment, social protection, and fiscal policy. And last but not least, we have Johnston Makubo, who is the Deputy Commissioner for Taxpayer Engagement and Operation at South African Revenue Services. He oversees the tax and customs operations, enforcement, and specialized functions at SARS. We do have one of our panel members as well joining us online. Her name is Gemma Wright, and she is the co-executive director at Southern African Social Policy Research Insights. Her research interests include poverty, inequality, social security policy, and tax benefit micro-simulation. Now, this is how today's discussion will be structured. First, we will have opening remarks from our panelists. I will give them 2 minutes. And from there, we will have a discussion, after which I will give an opportunity to the audience to ask questions. I do encourage you that while you're listening to the conversation, to also reflect and take some notes for future deliberation during the Q&A session. Thank you. I am going to give you 2 minutes, and you can share your opening remarks, and yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. I thought load shedding was done. Thank you. I think important for us that we are having a conversation around PIT, a very important contributor to tax revenues that we collect as a South African Revenue Service, characterized currently by quite a small base that we have to extract taxes from. The moderator has spoken about the distribution within that base, suggesting that there's quite a large number of taxpayers that are below the minimum tax threshold, and that brings about its own challenges in terms of what characterizes the current PIT system. And I think it's important also that as I open, one points out to the focus, maybe overly so, on the formal economy as we look at the PIT system, and maybe the limited focus that we have on the informal economy, because we are convinced that there needs to be also a view around what we see from policy from the informal economy. I'll stop there in my 2 minutes.
Thank you so much. So I want to start by pointing out that we sometimes forget that we have an extraordinarily well-developed and very clean personal income tax system. I mean, it wasn't that way 30 years ago. So 30 years ago, we had this very complicated system where we, for example, had different tax schedules for married persons, by which they really meant men, single persons, and married women. And that was eradicated quite early on, but there have been progressive reforms over time to make sure that there are fewer and fewer exemptions in the system, that the system's transparent, it's fair, and it's incredibly well administered. So I think during the course of this discussion, we shouldn't lose sight of those aspects, even though our focus is largely going to be today, I think, about talking about how do we get a bit more revenue and how do we make the system even more equitable than it is now. So let me put one little fact into the discussion before my 2 minutes is up. So when we heard in the introductory remarks something about the distribution of taxpayers and how that top income bracket pays more tax than any other group. If you think about this instead from a household perspective, so if you think about South African households and you divide those up into what we call deciles, so the poorest 10%, the next 10%, and so on. The richest 10% of South African households accrue 63% of total income in South Africa, all right? So a highly, highly unequal society. But those 10% of households pay 80% of personal income tax. So that's a good way for you to immediately see that there's progressivity in the system, right? So 63% of the income, but they're paying 80% of the tax. That's not to say that there aren't perhaps ways to increase that. I think we're going to have a discussion today, for example, about medical tax credits and retirement contributions, which primarily benefit those richer households. But right now, it is a well-designed and progressive system. Thank you.
Thank you. So a lot of what I was going to say, I think, Ingrid, you have said, so thank you very much for that. I think for my 2 minutes, here's what I want to say. I asked myself why I was invited. I'm very uncomfortable when I'm around academics and policymakers, but I think there's a reason why I'm here. A lot of reasons a lot of my views on the topic, I think you've laid out well. 2 points to make. One, that narrow target group that we find in that PIT corridor, for me, in itself, is a symptom of inequality in the country, not the other way around. We're not an unequal society because we have a narrow group. We have a narrow group because it's a very unequal society. And I think that framework is very important for the conversation we're about to have, right? I'm going to pause it there. I promise I'll say more on this, but let me pause that here for my 2 minutes. Yanga?
And thank you, good morning. When the speaker here was saying that, how do you disseminate the research? When I was at Treasury, I thought everybody knows what you are doing. Wait till you are on the other side at the tax ombud, when people don't even know what we are doing. What causes inequality more is the lack of taxpayer education, lack of access to information. For example, taxpayers will go to SARS, knock at the SARS doors. They don't know that the process of filing a complaint, you must first file with SARS before you can come to the tax ombud. Hence, with the SARS colleagues that are here, I think we request that in each and every SARS office, there is a process of filing complaints. Because now we find ourselves at the office of the tax ombud, because taxpayers don't have the information, necessary information, whereby we can assist them with their complaints. We end up rejecting them because they did not do the necessary process of filing complaints with SARS. So my problem when I'm on the other side is lack of taxpayer education, lack of knowledge, and taxpayers don't know what to do. And you can understand that when you are frustrated because we deal with taxpayers from the lower income groups because they don't have money to pay for the legal services. To them, there was a taxpayer that I phoned from Pietermaritzburg. She said to me, 2,000 can be small to you, but to me it's a big amount. I can't go to SARS every day and SARS keep on giving me the reference number, and yet this reference number is not the Complaints Management Office reference number. I'm not taking that. So this implies that in our offices, in order to improve compliance, we must look at ways whereby we can see if there are any compelling circumstances that the taxpayer was not aware of the SARS processes, whereby we can be able to help our taxpayers. But all I can say, taxpayer education is very important.
Thanks, Yanga. Thanks, everyone else. From our perspective, we have huge problems in this country. Inequality is incredibly high. Poverty is high. You need resources to try and reduce poverty, and you want to try and reduce inequality at the same time. When you look at personal income tax, it looks like a win-win. If you increase personal income taxes, you can get resources for more spending, and you could potentially reduce inequality. So, and that's the first thing you would think about when you look at this tax instrument. When Yanga and I were trying to provide advice, to the minister, after the global financial crisis, revenues dropped dramatically, expenditure had gone up, our revenues never recovered, so we had this big gap. Suddenly you're facing a debt problem. Earlier we were talking about debt going up by 10 times. So what's the first thing you do? The first thing was, well, let's try and increase personal income taxes, which we did. But then we didn't get as much revenue as we thought. And then now you're worried about, well, what was the economic impact of trying to do this? And so we've been grappling with these issues since 2015, really, to try and say, well, is this the best approach? And, what can we do? As Ingrid was saying, a lot of effort has gone into the system over the last 20, 30 years to make it as simple as possible, to cover as many types of income as possible. 30 years ago, you could get company cars and holiday accommodation, and it wasn't taxed. Guess what all the executives were doing? They were getting these fancy cars, lovely holiday homes. Now it's all taxed. We've got this very broad fringe benefit system. We tax capital gains. That only came in 2001. So we've tried very hard to close all those loopholes and increase taxes. And now what else can we do? So there's no low-hanging fruit anymore, but hopefully we can find some today. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm going to give this opportunity to Gemma Wright, who's online.
Warm greetings to you all. I'm Co-Executive Director of Southern African Social Policy Research Insights, a not-for-profit organisation that's grew from a research centre at the University of Oxford on South African social policy. We're committed to harnessing administrative data for evidence-based policy making, and it's been a real privilege to work closely with SARS over the past 5 years as part of the UN wider SHI programme to develop and refine a personal income tax micro-simulation model called PITMOD, which is underpinned not by survey data but by anonymised administrative tax records. This enables simulation of tax reforms using an internationally used micro-simulation software. And we've recently completed a study looking at broadening and deepening the personal income tax base, which Professor Pertila referred to in his opening remarks. And I'll say a little bit more about that later. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, panelists. Thank you for all your opening remarks. You've provided a high-level perspective of the current tax system in South Africa. In your opening remarks, you highlight broad challenges and opportunities within the personal income tax framework. More so as it relates to inequality, there was a lot of theme around inequality. And also you've touched on a little bit on some trade-offs with policy and some enforcement strategies that you briefly spoke to. I'm going to go to the question now, and the first question I'm going to pose to you, Christopher. And in your opening remarks, you touched briefly on some of the policy considerations, and I'd like you to expand on this, in particularly drawing from your expertise as the acting head and financial sector policy at the National Treasury. If you could take us through how these personal income tax policies have influenced taxpayer behavior. And I'm asking this because you've mentioned that in 2017, you increased, the tax bracket, there was 45% was added, but the income did not increase as such. So I would like you to talk on that. And I would also like you to look to speak to some of the work patterns and the economic participation or other behavioral trends that you perhaps may have observed. And perhaps you could also draw from the research that you've worked on SA type, because I think it links directly to some of the points that you've alluded to.
Thanks very much. So in 2017, what we thought was quite a big reform was to increase the top rate from 41 to 45% for those earning above 1.5 million. In our internal modeling, we had assumed that there would be a reduction in taxable income. If you look at the international literature, there's this taxable income elasticity of around 0.4, which means that the rate goes up by 1 percentage point and your taxable income, or not 1%, and your taxable income drops by 0.4. So it's, people try and reduce how much they declare to their revenue authorities when there's this big increase in tax. So it's been a few years. Luckily, there's a lot of data in. I did a paper with Yuka and Nadine, who are here, just to look at, what actually happened. As I was saying earlier, we've done a lot of these personal income tax increases between 2017 and 2018, but we kept having shortfalls. And what was going on? Why were we still having these shortfalls? Now, and it's quite difficult to tease out, because at the time, there were problems at SARS. There were governance issues at SARS. So was it because SARS was doing a very bad job, or were taxpayers reacting, or what was happening? So we tried to look at this, and it's a very difficult thing to try and tease out, because technically, we're at UNISA, so there should be lots of academics here. Differences, trying to find control groups and treatment groups. It's not actually that easy, because you don't randomly allocate one person to get 45% and see how they reacted compared to someone else who had the same income but didn't get it. You've got to be fair in the system. So you've got to look at control groups with people slightly lower income. But it was a very nice change for us to do that. And we didn't do the change based on how nice it was, on the academic reasons for evaluating it. But it was a nice change to do that. But the impact we found was there was a much larger behavioral response than we thought. And what actually happened there, the elasticities that were coming out were closer to 1 rather than 0.4. And if it's at 1, that means you're actually losing revenue when you increase this rate. And the reason is because they'll drop the taxable income that they report to SARS, but that whole drop on income is now no longer taxed. Whereas only that last bit above the 41% that's now at 45% is the revenue that you get. And that drop outweighs the additional revenue you get to 45. So we were trying to look at, what actually is it? It didn't look as if the people who were working and employed salaries dropped their income that much, the normal income they receive, but the allowances and the bonuses did drop. So it looked as if they were trying to adjust their circumstances just to avoid this tax, and more than we had expected. So that's the behavioral impact that we're very worried about. And we thought our regime was quite tight. At exactly the same time, we increased the dividends tax rate from 15 to 20% because we were worried about business owners who then say, well, I can give myself a wage, but now it's going to get taxed at 50%. I'd rather actually pay corporate income tax and pay dividends tax than give myself dividends. So you'd create this arbitrage there. So we thought we were clever by trying to adjust that to get rid of the arbitrage. But another interesting part of this is that we announced that dividends tax rate increase, which was effective immediately, which was quite a shock to the market. And yet when you look at the dividends tax revenue, surprise, surprise, there were huge dividends that were declared the month before. But how were they declared the month before when the minister only announced? Anyway, so they must have recorded and had these AGMs where they declared dividends just the month before. So all these behavioral impacts from taxpayers just to get around paying more, which we need to be very careful of. And we try and get around that by, for example, not adjusting for inflation, which a lot of people say it's a stealth tax. It's not a stealth tax. We are very clear in our documentation. This is how much money we're going to get from not adjusting for inflation. And hopefully the impact on every taxpayer is so small that they don't then adjust their behavioral to do it. But it might still be having an impact. And there were some papers that were done, academic papers, by Harris Kemp, for example, that looked at this inflation adjustments and still found a behavioral impact of 0.4 on that taxable income elasticity. So I think what this is trying to do, and this research is trying to show, is that for policymakers, for all of us, when you change the tax system, people react. And you can't have these clear win-win scenarios that I was talking about until you've accounted for those reactions. And hopefully the policymakers and the politicians and others can respect that and understand that, and then we can get to hopefully a better policy outcome and better policy measures to try and achieve these other objectives that we're trying to. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for the detailed response. Yeah, it's not straightforward. There are trade-offs, and we need to engage in a balancing act. And I want to bring you in, Johnston. As much as it's the National Treasury that comes up with these policies, at the end of the day, as SARS, you need to operationalize this. And just hearing what Christopher had to say about behavioral changes, I would like you to comment from SARS perspective. What have you observed from these policy changes? Do you see changes in reporting behavior? I mean, he mentioned that now people are declaring less taxable income than they would have. So from your perspective, what have you observed?
Yeah, maybe before I touch on the observations, it places to the center the importance of informed policies, because if the policies are not thorough and research-based, I have to go look for the money somewhere. And if the money is not coming because there is behavioral aspects that were not fully understood, it suggests that whilst we have opportunities to adjust our expectations and our estimates in here, but it says we are using your resources to go look for that money as a tax administration, so it becomes much more challenging. So I think our observation is that we have seen an increasing level of non-compliance, especially within the provisional tax-paying community, which suggests that we now need to refine our strategies for enforcement within that particular group. Chris is correct. Not only did these individuals in their personal capacity see a drop, but also we saw that the companies that they are working within also started to declare lesser income. So we saw this not only ending with the personal income tax, but we also saw going into corporates. I think Chris and the paper that has been written does reflect the cross effect that moves into other tax products. I think for us in the administration, when we saw these reforms, whether it's this one or the retirement one, we look for the revenue, we expend resources in looking for the revenue. If it doesn't come through, we try to understand why is it not coming through. Is it because some of the people move from the formal economy into the informal economy to try and get outside the radar? What is driving it in essence? So we confirm that in our experience, we did see a level of non-compliance that increased. And you'll hear us later on talking about perhaps it's broadening the base in a different sense, in that those that are outside the net through smart technologies and synthesis of data technology and human capability need to be brought back into the base, need to be found and be brought into the base as part of, call it, a different version of tax-based broadening, because we think that the level of non-compliance amongst those that are in the high income earning capacity level requires that we take some enforcement and compliance strategies to make sure that we close that non-compliance. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes. Can come.
Do you want me to chime
Yes,
in?
yeah.
Excellent. Chris, so maybe my opening conversation on this is, I know just enough economics to actually be chaotic in this conversation because I'm not an economist. But there's a pool of data dating back to at least when I was in university that speaks about, the spillover effects, the effects that you can't preordain when you're making policy. And the truth is, Chris has very little choice but to take empirical data, do some real research, real analysis to birth a framework for policy, which you have done. There's still a middle bit on this, which is about the consultation process. So organizations like mine spend a lot of time in conference with you younger, when you were in Treasury, you'll remember, Grace with you, where we try to signal that this is what the impact will be. We do. Now, why do we do that? I think I can only speak for my organization. I'm an accountant. I work for an accounting firm. We love nothing more than crunching numbers, right? Now, we appreciate that what we don't have is all the data that sits behind the policy when it's being made. So we have a blind spot, but we use our best will to try to crunch our own numbers based on what we know, so we can share in consultation with the policymakers when these processes are coming up. So oftentimes, it's a full circle when, 3, 4, 5 years later, we're sat being told, hey, this is the outcome that came through, when we at that time said, but this is the only outcome that could come out. Now, especially for PIT, because Ingrid, where you started from about how efficient that tax is, all you can really do is to gauge sentiment, is to gauge behavior, and if you can crack that, you can do anything you want within PIT, right? Because to the point, what are you going to, if the bulk of it is from earnings, the collection mechanism is somehow enshrined and passed to, the legal incidence of it sits somewhere from you, et cetera. So we used to, many, many years ago, 30 years ago, Ingrid, when you were describing, I wasn't in tax then, but I bet 30 years ago, we had big teams in organizations like mine that used to advise on how you plan your affairs around this. We don't. I don't have a department that is advising anybody on how to plan around your income taxes. So the point I'm making here is, I think it's not just the policymakers that can crack this conversation. I think it takes all of us in society. Me, you, everyone having a point of view on this conversation, otherwise we never move. The second point I think I want to make on this is, if the system is that efficient, if it collects as much, should we leave it as that? I think that's a question we really need to reflect on. Because here's the thing, as policymakers, it's very easy for us to change anything we want. I mean, change the rates for all you call it. Do it by stealth, don't do it by stealth, makes no difference, right? You can change the rates because you have the power. If you're government and you're the policymaker, you have the power to change the rates. Now, the question is, why are you changing the rates, right? And do you understand enough the impact that rate change is going to have? And have we as a society designed, agreed broadly the type of tax system that we want to have, right? I don't have answers to any of these, right? But I think I need to table that. I think the third point, the third point really on this is perhaps the conversation always is incredibly difficult when you're picking one tax type and trying to analyze it to the death. We're not going to solve inequality, we're not going to solve all of redistribution, just looking at PIT as one tax type. So we've got to look at the entire tax system. Right? Look at the entire system and say, what do we want to do with this system to make sure that we're trying to analyze it to the death? We're not going to solve inequality, we're not going to solve all of redistribution, just looking at PIT as one tax type. We've got to look at the entire tax system. Right? We've got to look at the entire system and say, what do we want to do with this system to make sure that broadly it's progressive, broadly it's got those redistributive ideals that we're looking for. And I think when you look at it through the PIT, I think Gemma's paper was really good. I was trying to get through the 4 options that Gemma had slated. I would do that too if I was a policymaker. I don't have any other choice but to think about those permutations. But they all give very terrible answers. If you're an accountant, you're going to go through all of this to make X percent, a very small percent growth at the top. Is it worth it, right? Especially if you don't know how the taxpayer is going to behave, and if we're going to be back here again in 3 years having this conversation. So let me pause there. Sorry, guys, I warned you. I'm going to be chaotic. I don't have answers. I only have better questions to ask.
Thank you. Thank you, Eko. Yanga, would you like to comment as well?
I think coming from Treasury side, we all know that when we raise taxes is when we want revenue. So, according to my colleague here sitting next to me, it's clear that the PIT, we can't do anything more from that side. So hence one can say that we need to look at the whole tax system and see what we can do better. And also, from the Treasury side, when we raise taxes, we think that SARS is able to do, because before we can finalize any policy decision, we must check if SARS can be able to administer. But we find out that along the way, SARS is not able to administer. And then there are glitches that are coming through. And then the revenue that is expected is not coming. So hence one can say that, do we need another commission of inquiry? I don't know.
Thank you. Thank you so much, panelists. Thank you for the rich responses. More questions than answers, but hopefully by the time we get to the end, we'll be somewhere. Yanga, I want to come to you again. I know you are at the Ombuds, but I think you're still in love with the National Treasury. I've heard you going back to it over and over again. But I would like to pose this question to you, and maybe before I pose the question, I want to say this, that tax policy cannot be divorced from the 3 challenges, or the 3 main challenges that South Africa is facing. And I'm talking about the unemployment, the poverty, and the inequality. And as someone who has been involved in some of these policy amendments in the past, I want to ask you, how do you perceive the impact of the previous personal income tax policies on inequality and revenue collection in South Africa?
I think before 1994, there was a lot of discrimination in the tax system. So come the promulgation of the interim constitution in 1994, the then Minister of Finance, Chris Lippenberg, announced the Cuts Commission of Inquiry. Because you can't have a tax legislation that is against the Constitution. So the Cuts Commission of Inquiry, the main purpose was to look at the gender discrimination in the tax system. And then I think Ingrid said that because after it, in 1995, in March 1995, that's when it was introduced, the single rebate system, the single tax system and everything, based on the recommendation of the Cuts Commission of Inquiry. And then now one would think that there is no longer discrimination, but it's not like that. There's still implicit discrimination. Because the implicit discrimination is found on the deductions that Chris was talking about, like your medical tax credits, your retirements. Because I'm in ATAF Women in Tax Forum, whereby when we look at the discrimination that is still on women in the ATAF, we feel that men still earn more than women, and men are in formal employment and women are in informal employment, based on how the society is, because women have to take care of families and all that. So now, if Chris is having those deductions for medical tax credits as well as retirements, that means that the system is still favoring men, because only most men can access that and most women cannot access that, based on the fact that the women are not always in formal employment. You find that the women are in contract because they have to look after their families. And I think also, because we are finishing the Women's Month, the discussions around women in the Women's Month, that has shown that that thing is still not eradicated. And then even in Treasury, we saw that the widows, they toy it and come to our offices, because another thing, women outlive men. The life expectancy of women is longer than men. So you find out that when your spouse, I'm gonna say a man, contributes to the retirement, it's a tax deduction. Now the husband is gone, now the widow is left. Now the widow has to pay tax. And they don't understand that they had to pay tax because the contribution was a tax deduction. So, and then what they were saying to us is that the tax system is discriminating against them. And then what made them also angry was that I am a widow paying tax. Here is a girlfriend of my husband getting maintenance, and the maintenance is not taxed. So, meaning that you live with this inequality, you were competing with this woman during the lifetime of this husband. Now, after the husband is gone, I'm paying tax on the pension, on the spousal pension, and yet the girlfriend is getting maintenance for the kids, and the girlfriend is not paying tax on maintenance because maintenance is exempt. So I don't know what can be done about that, but when I'm at the tax ombuds, those things are coming to the fore to say, because those are the people that you are dealing with. As I'm saying that, I'm no longer interpreting big policy issues. I'm on grassroots level, whereby I have to know the definition of tax period, what goes into the tax return, what is it that SARS wants on declaration. And these are the things that are hitting the lower level incomes. And what I want to say to SARS, they like to audit lower level incomes, the teachers, the nurses. Here they are saying that it's difficult to collect taxes from high net worth individuals, but those nurses, those teachers, they like to audit them. For example, you find out someone was married and then has got two surnames. And SARS will say, no, we can't combine your surname, because if now I get married now and I decide to change my surname at 50, SARS has got all my details under the name Mputa, and I decide to be Mrs. Axelson. So this implies that now this woman was retiring and she comes to us. SARS is saying they can't match the surnames. And now I'm retiring in 3 years to come. So those are the things. Please, SARS, don't go after the nurses and teachers. They make our economy. Thank you.
No pressure.
I'll give you a right of reply.
Clearly, I need a right of reply. And there lies in the challenge, because Miss Younger Axelson could have been created in Lagos, and a profile that is dubious, aimed at extracting refunds from a system, could have been created. Now, the balance between providing the service and protecting the fiscus becomes very important. The tax ombuds wants to make sure that profiles are not hijacked, and when they are hijacked, in one way or another, there is accounting that needs to be done. So, unfortunately, tax is blunt, and procedures are procedures, and there is very little flexibility that is in those procedures. Because if there was, there would be a lot of leeway for SARS employees to fiddle. So I think it's important that we take into mind how we balance providing the service and managing the risk that exists in the system. I mean, if you just look at how advanced systems are now and the attacks that just bots that get created to attack the tax system to be able to try and push through and get a chance to be able to create undue refunds. It's a serious problem. So controls, as Eco would tell you as an accountant, becomes very important. Of course, there are those that get affected negatively as you apply these controls. But I think a swallow doesn't call for a summer. I think if you look at the volumes that are processed by SARS in transactions, and you look at the distribution or the deviation of what we are talking about, Younger, the distribution tells you that we are dealing with exceptions. And we want to make sure that those exceptions ultimately are dealt with. But also, let's say, I'm glad that at EY there is nobody that is helping with structuring. I'm so glad that there is some conversion that is happening. But our data is not telling us. If you look at the assessments, additional assessments that we are raising, and the assessed tax that we get from PIT, and maybe let's not leave CIT out. But I think you look at offshore holdings, that data we're getting via CRS, and you start to talk about who are these individuals and how are they having these holdings. So it's truly not to say that the upper end is as holy as may have been painted. I think there is a need for us to appreciate that the arbitraging there comes through in a number of ways. So I want to make sure that there is that understanding that says, as we administer, also want to enforce, and what we are seeing is that there is structuring. There are structures that are being sold, not by my friend on my left, but we do see those structures. They actually mean that revenue mobilization becomes much more challenging and requires the type of resources that you may not readily have within a tax administration, because it's always going to be a talent war, moderator, between my friend at the left and those of us that are in government. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your response. Would you like to come in as well?
He called me my friend, so okay. I think we're good. I do want to say one thing though, that the reason you have, so I think just a point of clarification, the point I was making about the cleanness and the efficiency in the system is income on earnings. So where you're employed and your employer is taking taxes as source before it gets to you, there really isn't much you can do. You're absolutely certain that because of the arbitrage between what Treasury did with dividends and corporate tax and the headline rate on income tax, you would always find a corridor of bad actors trying to find a way to structure through that. So perhaps the richer conversation, if we want to get to the inequality problem or the redistributive ideal, is how do you close those loopholes, right? How do you close those loopholes in legislation to bring a level of equilibrium between the income taxes and what a high net worth individual who's trying to be a bad actor could do.
Thank you so much. We've had some perspective from Younger, taxpayer rights and SARS enforcement, and a balance from the private sector. And I want to bring you in, Ingrid, and I think you're going to bring a balance to the war that we see between SARS and the ombuds. And perhaps if you can approach the conversation from an economist perspective, and as well as drawing from your research that talks to fiscal policy, social protection, and measures of poverty and inequality that you've done. What would you say are some of the key trends or outcomes that have emerged from previous personal income tax policies?
Sure, it's a big question. So I really like to echo his point about the fact that you shouldn't look at one tax handle on its own. So I do think we sometimes get a little stuck in those discussions, and we talk about, well, how do we squeeze a bit more revenue out of PIT, or how do we make PIT a little bit more redistributive? But actually, you need to think about the fiscal system as a whole. And I think when you take that step back and you look at the overall fiscal system, you see that this is a remarkably redistributive system. So the Gini coefficient in South Africa is roughly 0.65. If we all woke up tomorrow and the tax system had disappeared and the expenditure side of the budget was no longer in place. So just do that thought experiment. It's easier to think about that as, so that's what we call a morning after simulation, right? So we simulate this weird world where basically the state just disappeared. The Gini would rise to 0.77, right? So this is, we have the most redistributive fiscal system in the world. If you think about that gap between, so you can also think about it the other way, right? What does the fiscal system do? It reduces the Gini from what could have been a 0.77 to a 0.65. But a lot of that action is actually happening on the expenditure side of the budget. So I think Chris tried to make this point earlier that, you know, we look to the tax system as a very direct way of trying to redistribute by saying, well, let's make it progressive. Let's ensure that the tax pay more, the richer pay more taxes than the less rich. Sure, that's part of the system. But the primary goal of tax revenue is to fund the expenditure side of the budget. So you have to think about that in totality. And I think we've gone far, but I think this point about the sort of political buy-in is so important. Why is it that we don't see more enthusiasm for paying taxes, right? So every time we have a discussion about raising taxes, it feels like we're on the brink of a tax revolt, right? The discussions I was on the Davis Tax Committee, and every time we spoke about, for example, the wealth tax, you know, it just galvanized society into opposing more taxes because taxpayers don't necessarily feel that their money is being well spent, right? And so we have to get to a point in the discussion where taxpayers are feeling more that there's value in the taxes they pay. And so the one discussion I'd also like us to open up is to talk about whether there isn't room to bring more people into the tax net from lower income bands. So right now, the tax threshold is about 95,000 Rand. So if you earn less than 95,000 Rand a year, you pay no tax. As soon as you go over that, you start to hit a marginal tax rate of 18%, which feels quite steep. And I do wonder if it isn't worth having a discussion around should one not reduce that tax threshold slightly, and I'd be very interested to hear what my colleagues think about that, and bring more people into the tax net. Because what we see in other countries is taxpayers, and I know we're all taxpayers and that we pay VAT, but people think about personal income tax as a very concrete way of, I am now a taxpayer. If we bring more people into the tax net, even at a 5% bottom bracket of 5%, right, that they will be more engaged and more inclined to hold government to account. So that's my controversial bombshell for the day. Thank you.
Thank you. I actually want to pick up on the last point that you've raised, and I would like our panelists to comment on that as well. And I think the conversation quite a lot focus on the top income earners, but what I hear you bringing in now, you're saying, let's look at the lower tax bracket. Can we bring more people in the lower tax bracket, you know? And I would like you to engage on that as well. Maybe I can bring you, Gemma, in as someone, social activist, you know, if you could just come in with your expertise, your thoughts with what Ingrid have just highlighted.
Thank you so much. And for the great points that everyone has made thus far. And it is indeed true that the personal income tax schedule is progressive. It does an amazing job at reducing inequality and raising critical revenue. And there is a limit to what we can expect of it in the context of the structural challenges of low wages and very high unemployment. And one could, alongside the research that Chris and you had described as well, about the impact of the raising of the top tax band, and people's deft footwork in response to it, that the following tax year, we could feel that we should hold our arms and prioritise compliance for the time being. However, I would argue that in the context of the market incomes of the top decile having grown the fastest, we at Sasbury would really support the work that Ingrid and colleagues have done, where they've argued that it is correct for South Africa to continue to increase the progressivity of income tax alongside other measures. And so I'd argue we needn't feel too defeated at this time, both in terms of potential tweaks to PITs, which can be empirically tested with different assumptions of behavioural responses, and also looking at the broader tax mix, and as Eka said, importantly closing the loopholes that there are. And in our recent essay-tied study, we did exactly what Ingrid was referring to, by testing two different tax reforms at the bottom and at the top of the income distribution of tax-registered individuals. Because it's the case that, certainly in 2020, of those individuals with employment income over £1 million, their incomes were 9 times higher than the average of all registered taxpayers. So it is highly skewed, the employment income, as we know, in South Africa. But conversely, the bottom 50% of registered taxpayers in 2020 were not paying personal income taxes. They fell below the minimum tax threshold. And so there are ways in which we can explore making adjustments at the top and the bottom of the income distribution of registered taxpayers. We explored two modest changes. Firstly, lowering the start of the top tax band to £1 million rather than 1.5 million rand to bring in additional people to the top tax band, but not changing the rate. But then at the lower end of the distribution, we reduced the value of tax rebates across the board, which has the impact of lowering the minimum tax threshold, and introduced the very small 5% tax for low-income earners in the 40th to the 50th percentile. So that new group had a maximum tax rate of 5% and maximum liability of 1,200 rand a year. And the micro-simulation model, PIT mod, that we used for this enables an infinite number of different possible scenarios to be explored, but these are two examples. And we found that those two tweaks didn't prejudice the progressivity of the personal income tax system, and importantly didn't reduce poverty. So 30% of the population were below the lower bound poverty line, both before and after having made these hypothetical changes. But we were also able to show that if the additional revenue raised from this policy reform, even taking into account an estimate of behavioural responses, if that revenue was plowed into the social grants, then 600,000 people would be taken out of poverty by making those two tiny tweaks at the end. So I think with data and, as Eka says as well, consultation and engagement such as these, it is possible to continue to explore ways in which poverty can be reduced and inequality too. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Gemma. Eko, would you like to come in as well?
Yes, so can I answer your direct question? I really like it. To start with, I really like the idea of how do you get more people to be in this conversation. But I think the start position has got to be, why are we doing it? Are we doing it because we want more people to join that social contract? Or are we doing it because we're trying to raise revenue? And I think we need to be clear on it, right? Because that insincerity, if it does manifest, is going to erode any of the effort you make in getting people in to begin with. I teach a course in Oxford on tax morale. You will agree, is the hardest subject to get data on for markets like this, right, that actually show anything that is positive. And we need to understand why. I think we all do, but it would be great if somebody sponsored a very good study, a very good research on the topic of tax morale in the country and what we actually do. Now, as much as I like it, Ingrid, I have a few cautionaries I want to throw to it. So my first one, I think Gemma touched on it, was broadly the consultation process. I'm gonna hack all of that into the transparency point, because I think, Chris, you mentioned the point about taxation by stealth, and this could easily, run that conversation amok, because that's what it will feel like. It will feel like, all right, we're trying to get people into the tax net, but actually behind the scenes, what we're trying to do is to tax more, is to get a way around it. So transparency is going to be a big thing. I think the second thing that I would talk about is fairness, and not fairness in the redistribution sense. Let's park the redistribution conversation for a second. I think it's fairness in the study that sits behind who actually is in this band we're talking to. So if that band is made up of sort of new mothers, are we really discriminating against new mothers? Because I think that demographic is a very special demographic, and we need to spend a lot of time thinking, so what's the reasonable expectation that we've set for that group, and then how would this go down? And I think my third and final piece will be, I'll look at Johnston and say, hey, how ready are you for this? And is the system as SARS ready for this? Are we going to treat those, that group in us new taxpayers who are coming into the tax net? Are we going to spend the time doing that education, bringing them aboard? Because all of these are important. I want to say again, this room and everybody in here is incredibly privileged. We can do anything. We can, any rate, we can define the base anyhow we want, put a number to it, organize research to support it, etc. I think we need to think about the people, and I know we're all people, and we're people too, but you need to really think about the poorest in society. You're essentially saying this is someone, arguably, who's earning income for the very first time, right? And you want them to be part of a contract. Now, how they behave is oftentimes not a result of them and who they are, it's a result of how we introduce it, right? So that introduction is going to be quite key. I suppose the counter to your question would be, should we also think about some of these bands and actually reducing the rates for them, because the spillover behavior, net, it may not be revenue, it may not improve revenue, but it may have a knock-on effect somewhere, or maybe one of the 8 things that SA Tide is focusing on. It may be, I really want to understand what SA Tide is doing in the labor space, right? And can we look at all the actions coming out of there and actually revisit this conversation through that lens? How do we design a tax system that encourages what we're trying to do, what the research is showing on what we need to be doing with the labor market? So let me pause that there.
Thank you. I think Johnston maybe wanted to speak, but before he speaks, I just want to pick up on the point that you've made about tax morality, that sometimes looking at the lower tax bracket as well, there may be movement in terms of positive tax morality. And that as well may help to hold government to account, because sometimes when you are not paying taxes, you don't care about what the government does. And the more we have more taxpayers in the system, the more they're going to care more, and the more there's going to be a rise in civil movement. And so that's the important points that you raised on tax morale as well.
Can I put just one right on that? Because I think it's a very important distinction, right? The point on morality in tax, which is, am I going to do right or am I going to do wrong? And morale in tax. Morale is, who here is cheering when they find out a new tax has been introduced? Now, to a taxpayer that feels weird, but actually it's a very important part of the seasoning to make that tax policy work, right? And that morale play, I think it's a broader societal conversation. I don't think the answer sits in the design of the tax system or the base itself. It's a broader society. It's a broader conversation about that social contract with government and policymakers.
Thank you.
Look, I think if we accept that the 7.5 or so that is below the threshold is already in employment, I think we've demonstrated that bringing them in from a systems and technology is not an issue. However, it's the change management that you need to deal with from a behavioral point of view. Maybe let me throw into the mix a practical tax administration issue, because the targeted 5% introduction and the type of taxpayer that will come from there is quite vocal in asking questions around, before you introduce that marginal tax rate, how have you made sure that everybody that ought to be in the net is in the net? That those that are driving around with flashy cars are actually paying their taxes. Just a data point, 150,000 taxpayers or individuals in the country that we found last year that have got serious economic activity but are not in the tax net. Now, if that population finds this out, they are going to say, you're actually, to the OTO earlier, you're actually going for us, the teachers and the nurses, but you are leaving those that are able to hide from you. So I think there's a question to be answered around, how do we tap into what we don't see naturally? What doesn't present itself to us? Because otherwise we run a risk of going too deep in what we see without looking for what is not presenting itself to us. Because we are talking here about returns-based information. And those that give us the data that we use in policy and policy research may negate those that don't give us returns that we use in coming up with policy. So I think it's a balance of making sure that, yes, this tax administration data informs research and does so without us being apologetic. But I think there's also just this compliance part of the conversation of saying, how do we broaden the base, as I said earlier on, by making sure that those that are in the illicit space come into the net, and that more taxes are collected from the fiscal system. I thought I would raise that.
Thank you. Sure. Yeah, I think it's very complex. It's not as straightforward. Chris, you also want to come in, or do you want? Can I move on to the next question? Yeah. Okay. All right. Sure. Yeah. It is complex, and what I get from here is that when you fix one part, there's somewhere else where you're going to get issues. And maybe, Ingrid, if I can come to you again here. In the previous discussion, a lot of us commended the personal income tax system for its progressive nature. But also what I get from the same discussion is that there are competing priorities. And the question is, how do we balance these competing priorities? How do we maximize tax revenue from the personal income tax side of things while not discouraging labor and economic activity? And that's the question that I would like.
Sure. I mean, I think that's just a really tough question. I mean, one can never do away with the behavioral effects, right? I mean, there is no pure tax, which is just going to be, this magical instrument which doesn't have a negative impact on growth. Every tax handle has some negative impact on economic growth. It's going to have at least a small impact on labor supply. So what you want to do is you want to be as non-distorting as you can. And I think that's what you need to think hard about. And so I think this discussion that is going on right now around medical tax credits and the retirement contributions is incredibly interesting, right? So think about the retirement contributions, and I thought Younger's point was fascinating, that it's largely men that are benefiting from that. Okay, but at the same time, there are the spouse pensions that ultimately get paid out. There are families benefiting from those. So it's an interesting question. So about 72 billion in revenue gets lost because of the retirement contribution, the fact that you can deduct your retirement contributions up to a threshold. Can you do that in a better way, possibly? And there's a great essay type paper which talks about the fact that perhaps right now the greatest benefit goes to those right at the top of the income distribution, because you're avoiding that 45% tax, whereas the person at the bottom end is only avoiding an 18% marginal tax rate when they make their contributions. So there's probably a better way of doing it. But that's not the same as saying we should actually just try and get our hands on all 72 billion and do away with retirement contributions. I mean, the savings rate in South Africa is incredibly low. I would be very, very anxious if we said, let's not incentivize retirement contributions at all. So I think that's where these balances come in, and it's more nuanced than just looking for revenue or just worrying about redistribution. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Echo, I would like to bring you in here as well. You've spoken about how it is important not to only look at the personal income tax system, but to look as the system as a whole. And for a moment, I would like you to put your private sector hat and also maybe your experience and as the Africa tax lead at Ernst & Young. Our policy choices, have they been effective? And are there areas where adjustments need to be made to the tax mix that could improve sustainability, fiscal sustainability and equity to better meet some of the socio-economic challenges that we experience in South Africa? And perhaps you could also draw some comparison between South Africa and other African countries. And yeah, thank you.
So thank you, Dr. Ndlovu. This is, if I could pass on this question, I would say pass. Because it's a tough ask. I think there are 3 parts to it, right? I think the first part is, has what we've done been effective? And for what it's worth, I actually think we've done a lot of good. I think the reasons, if we are to say it's ineffective, it's not because of the tax design or the mix. It's not because of the design or the mix. I think it's a broader structural economic conversation. It's a broader structural social contract, sort of conversation. Because if you were to take what my good friends, to my left have done over the years and put it in a brand new country that didn't exist, you're on a very good path, right, by the design. Yeah, there's the bits that we need to solve for and close, etc., but you're on a very good design. So it's very dangerous going through what is the mix, what should we have? And I often get in trouble here because, if I'm to drop the wealth tax conversation, you would have to plan another conference for us to have the conversation. But I think some of the emergent conversations, both on the continent, elsewhere, seems to suggest that you're probably, when you are where we are, your options are very limited. You're probably looking at 2 things you could do, right? A multi-tier VAT system where you're taxing Hermes, bags, and which on paper, great. I mean, you can write the best papers, the best academic research to support that. My friend to the far right will say, no. Yes, that's a lot of work. 1, to administer. 2, politically to get that across the line. It's a non-starter. So that's that one option. The other option on wealth is, so as a firm, we don't believe in an ongoing wealth tax, a wealth tax where you whack every single year. It's insane. It's just not going to work. Now, could you look at some other design, like a once-off wealth tax, right? That is once-off, you're very clear, you're very transparent what the collections are going to be used for. You're sincere enough to make sure that those contributions go there. Could work, and I want to say could, small c and underline, could work. Why? Because, it's looking retrospectively. It's not looking in the future, so it's not going to distort any decisions that you make in the future. But if I'm a taxpayer, I'm looking at it saying, is it really going to be once off? Number 1. if I'm a taxpayer, I'm going, the second you put that in a proposal document, sorry, I think I heard that example come up before about dividends. The second I see that in a proposal document, I'm going to start behaving erratically, right? Such that by the time that tax actually comes in, there's very little left for you. So again, politically, you can't get it there, and practically, even if it does come in, I don't think you're going to get the revenues that you need off it. So when I take those two, that multi-tiered VAT, and these are the big blockbusters, there's a lot of little tweaks you can go make to generate some revenue, but these are the two big blockbuster conversations that, that generally these conversations circle around. I look at the society I live in. I'm very practical. I think a lot of where we get policy wrong, we're trying too hard to compare ourselves to some other country. We need to be very realistic. And I'm an accountant. I can only ever be realistic and look at the numbers in the economy I'm in. When you look at this economy, I don't think you should be doing any more from tax. I think we should be looking at the other 6 or 7 work streams on SA Tide and actually all rally behind it, because those are real growth drivers, economic. Tax is the after effect on all of that. Tax is not going to be the precursor to that growth coming through. So, sorry, Dr. Ndlovu, I know I've escaped your question, but it's also because I don't have an answer to that. If there is, I will. I think the guys on my left will probably. Okay, right. I've got one person agreeing with me.
That's
Chris?
fine, and I think maybe, Gemma, if you could also come in here and just focus on the redistributive outcomes. I want to ask you, if you look at our current tax mix, have they been effective in enhancing the redistributive outcomes, or are there adjustments that perhaps could still be made in order to meet some of the socio-economic challenges?
Thank you. Just very briefly, Ingrid made the point of the extent to which the Gini coefficient is reduced to 0.65 by the tax system already. Looking broadly at the tax mix, there are other considerations that can be reviewed. An earlier SA Tide paper that we wrote with members of SARS looked at value-added tax and the extent to which zero-rated items are, the benefit of that is enjoyed in round amounts most by wealthy people who are purchasing things the most. And we explored a different way of rerouting revenue through the social grant system rather than through the zero rating of taxes, and found that was more effective in terms of reducing poverty than the zero rated items. That's obviously extremely politically sensitive, but it's well worthwhile to empirically explore these issues. That's all I'll say, conscious of the time. Thank you.
Thank you, Gemma. I want to go to my last question, and I'm going to speak to you, Johnston. I think everything that was discussed here, at the end, it comes to you. And you've also highlighted the importance of efficiency in tax administration and tax collection. And you've mentioned how it is important that before we even start increasing the taxes, we consider that everyone is included in the net. And my question to you is that what are some of the successes that you can speak to us about that have achieved through past strategies to strengthen personal income tax enforcement in South Africa? And looking ahead, is there anything more that we can do to increase efficiency and make sure that everyone is included in the net?
Sure, thank you. I think if you go back as early as 2007, I think when we started to say compliance needs to be at the back of an enabled environment, and we started to modernize and introduce such things as e-filing, it was to try and make sure that it's easy to comply for taxpayers. Fast forward to 3 years ago, where we said we are in an environment that is becoming very data-driven. Tax administrations need to be smarter, relying on big data. Now that we're talking smart taxation, how do we then make sure that relying on AI allows us to be able to introduce such things as auto assessments, to try and make sure that we are able to comply voluntarily, because we are able to leverage more of the data that we have. And I think some reforms early 2010 around making it compulsory for people to register. The tax register moved in 1994 from 1.8 to around 28 million currently. Of course, those movements have helped us to enforce better. What should we be doing going forward? I think international cooperation becomes important, especially on PIT. We need to know who is of the South African citizens that are holding property in Dubai and elsewhere, other jurisdictions, so that we are able to have eyes everywhere. And as we cooperate with other tax jurisdictions, I think it's going to be more important to leverage such things as automatic exchange of information or exchange of information on request as we audit people, to be able to send to our counterparts requests for information. And as you can tell, it becomes about how do you get a 360 view of the taxpayer, and utilizing AI and data so that we can be able to then enforce better. But I think it's also important to say that we are starting to have machine learning that is giving us very good results around allowing people to know that they need to voluntarily comply, because when we see your earnings at this level, to dispute it will be very hard. In fact, about 97% of our auto assessments get accepted by taxpayers. Of course, we can talk about the other 3% and why they are just, and we know they are just because they've got rental incomes and incomes that we don't see as SARS. But increasingly, we are working on how we can expand the use of data to be able to be a smarter tax administration in how we actually do the enforcement. And again, lastly, we would not hesitate to partner with the likes of the NPA to actually go after those that are deliberately defrauding the fiscus. I must pause and say, as the last point, that tax administrations require funding. Because if you are hoping to mobilize revenue, you can't be a shy investor, because contrary to other departments that may be cost centers in the expenditure side of the framework, it makes sense to look at the profit center and say, how do I short this up? How do I make sure that the capability is there to be able to deal issues such as transfer pricing? I mean, we still see, to your issue around the tax mix, we still see a lot of interest payments leaving the country by multinationals, royalties that are being paid, and we want to be confident that we've got the right skills to be able to look into those and investigate deeply to find any non-compliance. So I think it's important to take the rent that you have as the government and decide how is it adequately allocated to allow you further returns in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Johnston. I think your message was loud and clear to the National Treasury colleague at the corner. But I would have loved to bring you in, Yanga. We are out of time, so I'm not going to do that. But I think I would have loved to hear your response, because when they are engaging in these tax enforcement measures, are they infringing on taxpayer rights, and are they adhering to the Tax Administration Act? But we do not have time for that. Thank you, panelists, for the great work. I think we needed more time. We don't have the time. And so I'm going to allow Dick Forsland to share his views in terms of what we have discussed. Yeah. Dick, if you could please offer your reflection of the conversation. Okay, Dick is joining us online. I hope.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now. Yes, yes.
Yeah. Sorry, my laptop doesn't like the Microsoft Teams, so I can't show you my face, my handsome face, but I hope you can hear me. Yes. So I must say I read especially the paper on so-called taxing the rich paper, but also the other rigorous papers. And I agree with the contributors. I was happy to hear someone mentioning the CATS Commission from 1995, and someone speaking about moral and so on. The first one, because I think one has to look upon the personal income tax system in South Africa from a historical will sigh if I cite from the GEAR, the economic policy document GEAR from 1996. But I think it's important how this kind of was reversed, but on the worst times, you can say. You had some 2,000 employees leaving the SARS in a political crisis at SARS from 2015 and some years forward. And you had also the start of the Zondo Commission in 2018. So it was not kind of a good cultural, political time to increase tax moral in the country. And the cost impact conscious, which one of the papers speak about from high income earners, the cost, they felt, I'm sure they felt the cost was quite negligible, that they thought that they were in good conscience of evading and avoiding taxes. I know this quote, tax and death are certain in life. I think Mark Twain who once said it, but I'm not sure. But I think what the paper shows, what they show is that tax is not so certain in South Africa, at least. Otherwise, we don't have any death evasion or death avoidance. Otherwise, other than you can exercise of to evade death for a while, but you have tax evasion and tax avoidance. So the GEAR document kind of set out tax policy in a somewhat contradictory manner. And I just want to quote two sentences from you, which in a way contradict each other. It says on page 10, if you want to ponder upon this later, improvement in economic growth together with improved tax administration should lead to a strong increase in tax revenue to GDP. And the second sentence is, that follows, this will create considerable scope to effect further reduction in the rates of personal and corporate taxation, while maintaining a ratio of tax to GDP at about 25%. And as you know, the tax ratio to GDP in South Africa today is still 25%, about 25% tax to GDP. And in my view, this is absolutely what was set out in GEAR, together with the ambitious program to put all children, all the black majority and all who have been discriminated by apartheid and colonialists, to put all children in qualitative public education and to introduce the national health insurance. It was a completely utopian policy. And now it was kind of reversed under the gallow in 2015, 2017 in a completely different context. So what should the government, what should a new democratic government have done after the introduction of democracy in 1994? In my view, the answer is it should have done nothing at all. It should have done nothing. It should have kept the personal income tax system as it was. And if it had done so, and you can calculate this from the excellent publication Tax Statistics issued by SARS and the Treasury, well, the fiscus would have had from 2016 and forward something like between 150 billion to 170 billion more in tax revenue per year, all else equal. So this is kind of like the political and cultural background. And so what I think would be needed, beside kind of what would be needed is kind of historical research and qualitative research, in addition to these rigorous quantitative papers, in kind of, because at the end of the papers, when you do quantitative research, you have to speculate how you should interpret the behavior of when people are evading or avoiding taxes, or if they really was like that, they withdrew some of their labor from the labor market in reaction to these increase in tax rate. And you don't know that really. You have to ask people. And that, I think, is something to remain.
Thank you.
I think also there are some other Scandinavian colleagues or friends in the panels and in the audience, and they know that if you sort of want to have a good tax model, there will always be semi-compliance in the tax system, and there will be some people who don't want to pay taxes at all. But if you want to have a buy-in, a social contract of the middle class and at least a part of the rich in a country into a personal income tax system, they also have to be users of the public sector. And you have to create a good circle so that the public sector becomes a little better and better each year, or at least that it doesn't decline. And we have the opposite situation in South Africa today. The public sector services, health and education is becoming worse and worse. So even if you have to look at the whole tax system as a whole, and corporate tax avoidance and profit shifting is of course an important part of that, you have to look at the whole economic policy of the government. And the cornerstone of that now, unfortunately, is in fact to reduce the public sector as a share of the whole economy.
Thank you, Dick.
They have a policy of kind of strengthening the public sector and even increasing the public sector as a share of the economy. Then I think we will also reduce the basis for corruption, the interface between private and public. So you can't kind of get a better tax model if you are not make visible progress when it comes to deal with corruption. And one way to do that, or a basic thing to do that, is to reduce the procurement frenzy where you can't even buy a copiator in a public department without putting it out on tender.
Yes, thank you very much, Dick. Thank you so much for your reflection and being our first respondent to the conversation. I appreciate your contribution, and I think there's still more conversations that needs to be had, and we are out of time. I'm going to ask my panel that after the discussion they don't run away, so that if you do have questions that you'd like to pose to them, they will still be able to answer those questions. But right now, because of time, I'm going to hand over to the... Amen. Let's see. Thank you.
So much to our panel for such an enriched conversation. In the interest of time, we will limit our Q&A to a maximum of only 3 questions. In the interest of time, just 3 questions. So there will be a microphone roaming around the hall. Please, can you please assist us with that? So we will have Mema Sechava and 2 gentlemen on that table. Thank you so much.
advice to the future widows from a widow: make sure your husband marries all those women. We are facing a two-pot retirement system starting from Sunday, and I expect a lot of withdrawals from retirement fund schemes with effective tomorrow. And this is because people want all their money out because it will be inside forever. Before 1994, Venda ensured that it gives its pensioners their money, and we see how Venda is thriving. However, do we see a similar contribution to this new two-pot system, or is it another way to tax the poor more, considering that those in defined benefit schemes will lose a year of work each year they withdraw? Were the policymakers sincere in creating this system? Thank
you. Can we get all the questions and we'll answer them at the same time?
Thank you so much, MC. I will be quick. Thanks a lot, panel, for the wonderful contributions. So, to the Deputy Commissioner's point on challenges relating to collection. So I just wanted to just add, it's an observation that I made when I was doing my research in 2019. That there's a limitation on withholding taxes, mainly on those taxpayers that are in informal, occupations, like your pastors, local sportsmen and actors. So we pick up on the media that they get into a lot of trouble, as opposed to those that are informal, occupation. So, I just made some sort of a benchmarking to two of the countries that are doing well in terms of collection, So what they were doing is they actually emphasized more on streamlining early payment methods to those that are in informal, occupation. So UK using pay code to reserve, taxes on future earnings, and Italy using e-quick mobile app to make it easy for those to pay tax, because it's difficult. Mainly people who are in sports, fraternity, and in entertainment, they not much into academics and all that. So my question is, how far are we in terms of the reforms? Because I believe that will strengthen the base. Thank you.
Thanks. Hello, my name is Hassan Jacobs, and I'm actually based in Dubai. So I'm an international tax practitioner. I'm very interested from a policy perspective, and I'm almost disappointed that the panel is so blinded by the fact that PIT is an inevitability. I know in the environment that I operate, there is no personal income tax. There's zero personal income tax, and the reason for that is, I did a PhD in tax here, down the road here, when it comes to national and subnational taxes. And I struggle with the idea as to what makes one society so dependent on personal income tax, and yet we have a different society who is so doing fabulously well and is no dependence on income tax. And the answer to that is simple. If you look at the Middle East, whether you take Qatar or Saudi or Dubai or anywhere of them, if you just take Saudi, and you all think, yeah, but they got petrodollars, so they are rich and all of those things. But an academic can do this, the historical research will tell you. If you take all of the mineral resources of Saudi, and you take all of South Africa's mineral resources on the other hand, over time, they will question is, why is it that we say we should, the Tax Commission said it's a historical thing, so many of the panelists said so we have to do some historical research. Why is it that the mineral resources in the Middle East belong to government, but the mineral resources of this country belong to companies, with almost all of them established abroad? So all of the country gets none of the income from those mineral resources, and the taxpayer, the personal income taxpayer, must bear the burden for funding government when, just across the waters, the complete is the opposite issue. But that's just an observation. The other question that hasn't been touched here is, why is there an obsession in the policy environment to tax labor as opposed to taxing assets? Why is it that the working class must contribute, but those who have assets, the assets is not necessarily as focused upon as the labor is focused on. That is two observations.
Thank you. Thank you for all the questions. Maybe can perhaps start with the second question.
No, look, I think those that are in the categories that were mentioned would fall into our provisional tax system. We are looking into that space from an education point of view, but from a reforms point of view, there is nothing that I'm aware of, unless, Chris, we've got something coming up from a policy point of view. But in the current framework, we treat those taxpayers within the provisional tax provisions, and we do very deep education. In fact, if you go to our YouTube channel, you'll actually find a video targeting, or a webinar targeting exactly that particular group, because we really appreciated the challenges that they are facing in terms of compliance. And we believe that as we move forward, we would be able to teach and have the outreach and deepen our ability to get that segment of taxpayers to come on board. But from a reforms point of view, maybe Chris, you can take that. Thank you.
Shall I focus on the other questions? Yeah, thanks. I mean, on the first one, on the two-part system, this was after lengthy discussions and engagements with labor unions, with business. This was certainly not government coming with a scheme to try and tax you more. This is trying to create a more flexible retirement fund system that has better outcomes for members. We don't want members to resign to then access their pension fund, so we'll allow a portion that you can access without having to resign, which would be worse for you. But we also realize that people don't preserve enough for their retirement. When they move jobs around, they take all their funds with them, and then they've got nothing left for retirement. So we're trying to balance two objectives here, trying to preserve enough for retirement, but give a little bit of access to get you through those difficult financial circumstances. In terms of the tax on the withdrawals that you currently take when you resign are taxed. There are retirement tax tables which apply, and those are cumulative. So if you've withdrawn in a previous year, you actually pay quite a lot higher tax rates now because you're withdrawing again. In the new system, it's linked to the income you get in that year. So if you are in trouble, if you've lost your job, you have no other income, you can withdraw up to 95,000 from your fund tax-free. Whereas previously, if you had made previous withdrawals, you'd be paying 18, 25, 36% on those tax payments. So we think it's a much better system. There's another question on income taxes, labor, and assets, but maybe I can leave that for the panel. Thank you.
Thank you. Echo, can you take the next question?
I was hoping you would encounter me, because that's a very difficult question, and I presume that's the Middle East question. So here's what I'll say on that. Fair point. Yes, we don't have enough conversation about assets and tax on assets. At least from the outside, that's what it looks like. I can vouch that my two colleagues to my left spend a lot of time talking about taxing and tax on assets. We spend a lot of time engaging them on how to tax assets and what's the right way to tax assets. It is not an issue that is unique to South Africa. It's incredibly more difficult to tax capital, right? Because you've got to, PIT, as efficient as it is, you can easily model the behaviors. Capital is a different thing. It is very easy to fly away, to disappear altogether. So there's a balance you've got to keep. Now, that's not to say we shouldn't continue the conversation, and we will. And I mean, Younger and Chris will tell you the private sector holds them incredibly accountable on this conversation, on assets. But it is a fair observation. A lot of the discourse, at least in public, seems to be about personal income taxes, perhaps VAT, and less about assets. On that comparison with the Middle East, I don't know if that's the tax question, and this is me being very polite. I think we've got to understand that a lot of the tax system we have today in this country was inherited, right? It started from somewhere, and you're going to have to gradually unwind what you want to unwind in it and put in new pieces in play. Now, I wish I had a clean slate like the Middle East. It's a lot easier for me to design something that is efficient, that is more biased on assets, etc. But I think there's a part of that question that is way beyond tax. It's about societies, it's about culture, it's about religion, it's about what works in different places. And we started off with a handbook that already had something in it. Granted, yes, we have been through reforms, and we're not discarding that. But even in the most extreme of reforms, you're not tearing everything up and starting from scratch. I hope my guys in Treasury will tell me that's not what you did, right? So it's a little bit of a journey. I always come back to the fact that South Africa is still a young country. In the grand scheme of things, it's a very young country. And we will get there. It's a matter of time. I think the Middle Eastern, the contrast you make on petrodollars and natural resources in South Africa, I mean, it's an interesting one. I don't know much about, I don't think I've ever seen a paper with that analogy in place, but it's a very interesting point you make about who the masters are on those mineral rights, right? On those rights, on those. And again, I will invite, this is where I conveniently say, I look at my academics and my policymakers and the research funders to say this would be a great place actually for someone to launch research in. Very good questions, I have to say, and ones that arguably we should be addressing.
Thank you, Eko, for the detailed response. We've reached the end of our panel discussion, and I would like to thank everyone for lending us your ears, and most gratitude to our panelists. You've done a great job. Thank you so much.
Thank you. For our closing remarks, help me welcome Professor Kanal Sen, who's a director at the United Nations University World Institute for Development Economics Research. Thank you.
So good afternoon, everyone. I'm very pleased to make some closing remarks on behalf of not just UNE wider, but our partners in ESETIDE, National Treasury, and SARS. So really speaking for all of the institutions involved in this program. First, I would like to thank our hosts, UNISA's Department of Economics. Really pleased to see some senior officials from UNISA here today. That's fantastic, and thank you so much for your presence. Also want to thank the moderator, also from the Department of Economics, UNISA, Dr. Anlovu, for excellent moderation, a really interesting discussion that happened in the last couple of hours. I want to thank also our key partners. I mentioned, of course, the National Treasury and SARS, the South African Revenue Service, but also the United Kingdom Foreign Commonwealth Development Office. We have James here today, and the European Union also as our key partners. Without their collaboration and the support, this program wouldn't have happened. And for example, the work we're doing on tax data simply would not have happened and have certainly led to the evidence base we need for discussing some of the difficult issues that we talked about today. I also want to thank the panelists in this panel. Panelists, I just want to name them. So we have Chris Axelson, Johnson Makubu, Jema Wright, Ingrid Woolard, Yanga Maputa, and Ekau again. Fantastic insights from the discussion that happened today from all of you. I just thought I might sort of end first by reflecting on some of the important points that came out. I'm not going to be able to summarize all of them, but there were some things that I think is important for further discussion as we go forward in ESETIDE. One is about behavioral response to tax changes, BIT changes. and to understand the behavior responses, because without that kind of understanding of behavior responses, it's very difficult to know what will happen to tax revenues when you increase or change the PIT. I'm really pleased that one of the early work papers that happened in this area of understanding behavioral tax responses came from 3 individuals who are here in this discussion, Yuka, Pitila, Nadine Riedel, and of course, Chris Axelson here. So that's the kind of work we need to see in SETIDE. The second, I think, takeaway I thought was that was a question of enforcement compliance and understanding, and that's linked to the behavioral responses actually, and understanding how compliance and enforcement happens, understand exactly that better so that we can understand the behavioral responses. Third point I thought was that PIT should not be seen in isolation. We heard about the corporate income tax changes, the dividend taxes changes that also happened. So seeing PIT as a kind of broad set of instruments that you need to use so that one instrument itself cannot deliver what you really want. And that's a very important point that I think came from the discussion today. The fourth point, which I was really struck, and I was so pleased to hear this point, was that we need to worry about the gender implications of taxation. A fair tax system has to worry about those issues. And if there are implicit or explicit gender biases in the taxation system, that needs to be addressed. That was a very important point, at least I learned from the discussion, and I'm really glad that that was mentioned. The fifth point was a point around progressivity of tax and effectiveness of tax systems on PIT, with a link with the progressivity and effectiveness of expenditure programs. You can't have one and not the other. And there's a broader important point that came out of that, that while we think of the PIT as a tool for redistribution, which it is, and also to raise revenues, which it is also, we need to also think of the PIT as part of the social contract between the state and the citizen. It's perhaps the most direct tax that a citizen tends to see, and therefore, while we have the VAT and we have corporate income tax and so on, this particular tax has a very important role to play in state building and in the social contract. And I think it's a really important point that came out of the discussion today. I'm very pleased to hear this. So just moving on a little bit, and I want to say a few words about SETIDE, the tax work we're doing, tax data work we're doing, and just make the point that South Africa holds a unique position in Africa, both economically in terms of its access to administrative tax data. The comprehensive anonymized tax data that we have in our data lab in the National Treasury is something that's quite remarkable, and it allows for the kind of work we've been hearing that is feeding into this discussion today. And while many African countries are facing challenges in leveraging tax and system for inclusive growth, South Africa has the opportunity to set a regional precedent, to be a role model in terms of understanding how tax systems work, right? And of course, PIT being a part of this. So seeing not only the discussion that we heard today in South Africa about PIT, but seeing what we can learn from this for other countries in the region is very, very important. I think it also came out from the discussion today, especially from ECHO, actually. So I think that was very important. I just want to also mention just one more thing, because this was a lot of the dialogue here was about the research that SETIDE is doing and feeding from that. But also SETIDE has prioritized capacity building through workshops and training programs designed for government institutions, both locally and across the continent. This is something we really take very seriously. And the idea really is to try and equip officials in these institutions with the skills to effectively utilize administrative tax data for policymaking and reform. So that's something that we take very seriously. But the capacity building is not only with government institutions, it's also with the local academic community. So we have been having road shows that have been led by many of my colleagues from SETIDE with institutions, universities, institutions, to make them aware of the tax data, that there's so much potential for doing really nice research with the tax data. And that's something, again, we've taken very seriously, especially the last 1 year. So I just want to say at the end that I was going to talk a little bit about the research we plan to do in SETIDE, but already Professor Peter has told you about this, and there's lots of exciting research planned in this particular work stream on public finance for development in SETIDE. So I'm not going to go through all of that. But I want to say that we're completely committed, SETIDE, to deepen our contribution to evidence-based policymaking in the field of taxation. We think that's really important for us. And making sure that tax reforms are grounded in data and evidence, so that can really inform better understanding of how to generate revenue, at the same time meet the goals of social equity. So that's something that we're committed to for the future. So in closing, I want to encourage all of you here today. Some of you, of course, know SHI quite well and our program. Others, perhaps for the first time being here, to engage with us, with your policymakers, researchers, tax professionals, engage with us and to look out for what the work we'll be doing in the next few years. And finally, thank you again for your time and contribution. We didn't have much space for discussion, perhaps, but then we have a lunch outside, just to that on my right, and so perhaps it's an opportunity now for networking and asking further questions to the panel right here. So let me invite you for a light lunch and networking, and let's carry on the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, colleagues, for visiting us today, where we invite you to visit our library on the first floor, the Thabo Mbeki Library. So after networking, after eating, please visit us there. We thank all the stakeholders. We thank you for this opportunity. Welcome to the University of South Africa, the University of the Land, the University of Leaders, the university committed to... I thought people would finish off. Come on, UNISA, committed to reclaiming the futures of Africa. Thank you, colleagues.
Thank you.